Right, so good morning. My name's Ben. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm here to give my presentation on Soviet queerness and repression and its importance to the study of the Soviet Union and how that study can reflect back onto us as contemporary queer people. Um, One thing I do want to mention up top, I do want to give a brief content warning now that because I'm talking about queer repression and incarceration, there will be some discussion of both physical and sexual violence against queer people. Like, I've tried my best to keep particularly gruesome details out of this, but when I cover this kind of topic, that stuff is going to have to come up. So if that's something you don't want to hear about, I will absolutely not be offended if you need to dip at any point. And with that, we'll start properly. So I guess a good way to start is to talk about what I mean when I talk about queer people here, because when I refer to queer people as a group in this presentation, it's kind of a historical anachronism. There's a lot of difficulty finding a perfect phrase for such a disparate historical group of people for the purposes of this presentation. So when I'm referring to queer people, I'm referring to people who, due to their conceptions of their own gender, sexuality, and bodies, were punished both by the state and the kind of wider straight cis culture propagated by it. It's sort of people whose existence was seen as antithetical to wider Soviet society. So the conceptions of self and of queerness that emerge in the Soviet Union are often really different to those in the West across the same time frame. And you have to be prepared when researching queer populations from other nations and times that you're going to run into conceptions of queerness that do not map neatly onto kind of contemporary Western queerness. I prepared two little examples I found really interesting, compiled from Laurie Essig's really excellent work, Queer in Russia, that illustrate this idea well, I think. The first being Zhenya, who Essig interviewed, who at one time had considered transitioning before deciding that she lived at once as both a woman who loved women and someone outside the kind of standard gendered idea of a lesbian relationship. Zhenya articulated that she wished not to be defined only through sexuality, existing somewhere in between the traditional conception of Soviet masculinity or femininity. This particular understanding of a sexual and gender identity based on queer love, but outside the idea of lesbianism, can be understood to have been influenced by this kind of wider zeitgeist of anti-lesbian discrimination and medicalization, existing more as a rejection of the Soviet idea of what a lesbian was rather than of lesbianism, if that makes sense. Again, they're going to be very different to the stuff you're used to. On a more general level, privately, the Soviet queer person would primarily see themselves as queer and engage in queer sex, participate in the development of early Soviet queer theory and culture. However, when in public, some Soviet queer people would effectively consider themselves to be straight and cis. This fluidity of boundaries is really important to beginning to understand Soviet queerness. There's this sort of crossing back and forth between straight and cis or queer, never really settling permanently in either. It's not like changing into a facade or a disguise, it's that you could be both if you wanted to without contradiction, which I find really interesting. So the bulk of this presentation is going to focus on queer life in the latter days of the Soviet Union, because that's where the bulk of my research is in the post-Stalinist era. Basically, for the purposes of this presentation, all you need to know for context is that after the revolution and civil war, Lenin decriminalized homosexuality, and queer people lived in a kind of quiet, private safety until Stalin institutes Article 121 of the Soviet Criminal Code, which imposes pretty heavy prison sentences on gay men for sodomy. Around the same time, lesbian women, trans people, intersex people, and people outside the gender binary could be effectively kidnapped by the state and placed into state psychiatric institutions and subjected to various forms of conversion therapy for a whole variety of drummed up conditions. The main one being this thing called sluggishly manifesting schizophrenia, or SMS, which you could be diagnosed with for being a lesbian, but also for having sleep apnea or for printing banned material. Like, it was a real catch-all to institutionalize a lot of people, including a lot of queer people. It's also important to note that queer people do also face a significant amount of public violence and demonization at the same time, like alongside this kind of state terror. Dan Healy, who's a really excellent historian on this topic, kind of argues that conditions improve after Stalin's death, but I would argue that despite some kind of aesthetic change, the kind of material conditions for queer people in the Soviet Union like are the same up until 1991, like up in way into the Gorbachev era. So, oh, I got that too early. Okay, that's fine. It's near impossible to know exactly how many people were arrested for being queer. This is due to an inaccessibility of files in the post-Soviet era, and that a lot of people were given sodomy charges attached to other crimes. In estimate, however, from Laurie Essig and some other sources, around 560 men were arrested for sodomy in Russia every year, and around 850 men were incarcerated in all of the component states, so places like Ukraine and the Baltic states and Kazakhstan. Like in the 1980s, that many every single year. Primarily the most common method of discovery and arrest was through honeypot operations, wherein a KGB-affiliated person would have sexual contact with a queer person and then either arrest them or attempt to use them as an informant. This practice was continued up until 1989. So much of the makeup of late Soviet prison culture was based around this really strict hierarchy that relied on the subjugation of people below you. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy is the namesake of this presentation, the Opushchennye. It's a term which finds its closest translation in English as downtrodden. I want to make clear that while not every Opushchennye was queer, every queer prisoner was an Opushchennye, kind of lumped in with card cheats and paedophiles and child murderers. The queer prisoners who made up this class were forbidden from intermingling with other prisoners during recreation and mealtimes, and were subject to near constant physical and sexual abuse by other prisoners. Queer inmate Valery Klimov told Yaroslav Mogutin that he witnessed one who was beaten to death in a prison in Sverdlovsk. There were 100 men in our cell. 3 or 4 raped him every day and then chucked him under the bunks. It was bestial, a nightmare. Once 10 of them raped him and then jumped on his head. I nearly went mad in there. My hair turned grey. That's how people lose their sanity. Many are psychiatrically ill when they leave. This is not a unique case, as people like the aforementioned artist Yaroslav Mogutin and the poet Gennady Trifonov describe conditions as bad or worse for queer people in male prisons across the same period. So a good visual way of interpreting this culture of violence in Soviet prisons is through the study of forced tattooing among prison inmates. Opushchennye were demarked and singled out by being forcibly tattooed by the upper strata of prisoner, primarily with razor blades and blue ink from the inside of writing pens. On the left of the screen now, you can see the hand and ring tattoos of a queer prisoner nicknamed Masha. His wrist is Pidor, which on one hand is bad because it's effectively just the F slur in Russian, but it does tell us as historians that he was made an Opushchennye specifically for being gay, rather than for something like pederasty or card cheating. The 2 ring tattoos relevant to us are the ones on the little finger, which denotes his status as an Opushchennye, and the one on the middle finger with the 3 dots, which denotes that this prisoner was what they called a waffler or waffle eater. It was a prisoner who would perform oral sex on other prisoners without significant resistance. And this group was, according to Danzig Baldayev, who was a former prison guard, was primarily made up of more feminine and conventionally attractive prisoners, primarily being queer entertainers and actors. On the right is a much more blatant tattoo, simply reading Yasuka, or I am a bitch, carved into the forehead, though things like this would often also be carved into the buttocks with other phrases like cocksucker or rubbish heap. There's one in this book that is just I am a dog. A further important way these queer inmates were dehumanized and detached from other prisoners is that they were often forcibly branded with these images of nude women on their lower backs, so that while they were being assaulted, the higher status holding, often straight and cis prisoner had something to look at, effectively making their victim like more of a masturbatory aid than like a human being. This isn't the cheeriest subject to talk about, but as I will get to, there is a lot we can take from it. And before I move on to that bigger picture, I would be remiss not to mention prisons designed for women. Most queer people assigned female at birth were sent to psychiatric institutions for being queer, as being a lesbian or a trans man or non-binary wasn't strictly illegal. However, there were a lot of lesbian women in Soviet prisons. Though less violently enforced, there were similar physical and sexual abuses suffered unto a lower stratum of female prisoners, designated as wives by high-standing husbands. In an inversion, though, of the experience in male prisons, tattoos were largely limited to the higher stratum of interned women, instead of being forced onto a lower class like in male prisons. They were often a lot more ornate, and they were optional. They were seen as a sign of status for the kind of higher ranking women within prison. So I think that if you do any amount of actual reading and research into the conditions of Soviet prisons and even Stalin's gulags, much of the Western understanding of this aspect of Soviet society finds its roots in what was happening specifically to queer people. Once they were queer people in the Soviet Union, once they were in prison, as they were one of the groups that faced the most brutal violence the state and its prison population had to offer. So why is the study of the history of queer people in Soviet prisons so rare? Queer artist Yaroslav Magutin, pictured there in the center, articulates an important point in regards to the kind of invisibility of the kind of queer experience in jail. In that Valim Shalamov's Koloma Tales and Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago are probably globally the most recognized pieces of Soviet nonfiction dealing with the Gulag system. Yet, as Magutin argues, and I'm quoting here, there isn't a word of sympathy for oppressed homosexuals. He argues that in the far post-Stalinist era, which this presentation concerns, no one was really prepared to focus their research on queer imprisonment. In fact, Magutin argues that most dissident authors, while exposing the inhumanity of life in prison, hold firmly onto prison attitudes in their contemptuous dismissal of gays and homosexuality in general when considering this period of history. This attitude largely continues through the wider historiography of both Soviet prison and Soviet queer people. Anne Applebaum wrote an entire book on the history of Soviet incarceration that basically entirely leaves out the role that queer people have to that story, and it got awarded the Pulitzer. Like, that's how entrenched this sort of idea is. So part of this might be due to the fact that historical scholarship on 20th century dictatorships tends to focus on camps rather than prisons, like the Gulag and concentration camps. And though there have been recent works that have balanced this disparity in regards to Nazi Germany, the same really can't be said for the history of the Soviet prison system. There isn't really a lot of time taken for post-Stalinist prison research. A further explanation could be that much of the retrospective history of the Soviet project comes from Western straight and cis right-wingers with their ascendancy in history writing over the left after the end of the Cold War. And these are people who often practice historical disciplines that intentionally leave no space to look at queer people in detail. Though there are really excellent historiographies of queer rights in the Soviet Union by Russian and Western historians, like I've mentioned, like Laurie Essig and Dan Healy, the queer experience in the Soviet prison system is often left to the wayside. I do take a lot more sympathy in this regard, as reading in detail about the absolutely grotesque violence suffered towards queer people can be personally really hard to read when you're a queer person. Like when I was doing my wider research, because this presentation is based on a dissertation I did, there were days that I had to take off because it was absolutely brutal to read about it every day. But it's still the case that in these texts, often the sort of brutality of the prison system becomes a shocking little like snapshot, just to illustrate that queer people were afraid of getting arrested, without really saying anything of importance about queer people in narratives about the Soviet Union. So in regards to history and the study of the Soviet Union, I genuinely think that your understanding of the history of Soviet repression and incarceration is incomplete if you do not understand the role that queer people had in the maintenance of the prison system. Soviet queer people and the violence they suffered are worth far more than just being like a little blood-soaked anecdote in a wider discussion. It's something that can truly influence how you analyze the Soviet state, that can help influence your research and thinking on the entire post-Stalinist era. And though this, and as a kind of a wider point, though this presentation and my research has been focused on the Soviet Union as it's of personal interest to me, this same logic can and should be applied to other areas of history, like from things like the role of anti-queer policing in Victorian society, or the destruction of gender identities outside of the male-female binary by European colonial powers in the early modern era. Like the list goes on and on. Like queer people have existed throughout history. So if there's a part of history you're interested in, not as even as an academic, just as anyone, you can only benefit from you looking at it from a queer perspective, because you'll find something of importance that other people will just overlook. And to finish off, I want to build on that idea now, not as historians, but as just as queer people, like as individuals and as community. Like you're not going to solve all of your kind of internal contradictions and fix global queerphobia by reading that there was someone who felt like you and thought like you who lived in Kursk in 1972. But finding out about historical queer people can really help you start to divorce yourself from what the kind of wider current zeitgeist wants you to be. Like, I don't mean just in the sense that it helps you feel more confident in yourself when you find people like you have existed forever, even though that definitely helps me. Like, I mean primarily that you'll find whole new perspectives on queerness, kind of forged in situations you'll never experience in places you might never visit. But it helps you build this sort of centuries-long internal mythology to what it is to be queer. And you'll find things that challenge you and comfort you and educate you in ways that I don't think you can find otherwise without studying queer history. And if I can recommend anything, it's to find out the stories of regular queer people who kind of lived and loved and fought and died throughout history. Like, because I promise you'll find out something about yourself through that. And it doesn't have to be life-changing, it doesn't have to be mind-blowing, but you will find something. And yeah, I want to thank all of you so much for attending. This was my first conference ever, and you've been really wonderful. I want to thank Nick and Hannah and everyone at the Queer Disrupt team for giving me the opportunity. Dr. Stefan Goebel and Dr. Philip Bubai for all the support with this research. And at the end of my bibliography there, I've left my Twitter at, so if we don't get round to you for questions or you want to ask something in private or more specific to this presentation, or if you want citations even, or you want book recommendations, that's where to hit me up. That's me.